Hi, welcome everyone to Kanban for Everyone. I'm your host, Colleen Johnson, CEO of prokanban.org. And today we're kicking off a brand new series called Beyond the Board. So we're going to be learning different implementation stories about Kanban, what brought you here, what worked, what didn't, and what challenges you came across along the way. And today we're joined by our very first guest, Nick Brown from ASOS. Welcome, Nick.
Hello, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. So we're going to jump right in here and learn a little bit about your journey and what brought you here. I know you have metrics even to share with us and a few data points along the way that you can share about how Kanban helped the teams at ASOS. But let's start at the very, very beginning here. Tell us a little bit about yourself first and what brought you to ASOS.
Sure. So a bit about me. I've been, I guess, in the agile world for over 10 years now. So started actually in e-commerce for a logistics company in the UK, then moved into professional services, looking at the internal IT organization there, then moved into financial services. And then I joined ASOS May 2022, so just under 3 years now. Myself as a practitioner, I'm very passionate about data, metrics, empiricism. I think now more than ever, there's a growing need to tangibly demonstrate our impact in the organizations. We know the teams we're working with. So I kind of pride myself on that in anywhere I go, that I can show quantifiably the impact that I'm having.
So let's talk about ASOS. You said is it ASOS? Am I saying it wrong?
ASOS, yes.
ASOS. Okay. Tell us a bit about the organization. So when you joined, what was their current practices like, and what were the challenges that they were trying to overcome?
Yeah, so for people that don't know, ASOS is an online fashion retailer, purely online. We do a little bit of stuff in stores, but it's predominantly all online. We have roughly about a third of the organization sits in technology, so about just over 1,000 people. And we have roughly about 100 teams in technology. And ASOS, one of the great things about why I love working here is we're not rigid around what framework teams should adopt. So we very much encourage teams to think about their context that they're in and try to apply agility as best they can, or as most appropriate for the scenario that they're in. When I joined ASOS, a lot of investment had been done years ago around implementing good agile practices at team level, and kind of embedding things like visualization of work and working in a regular cadence. One of the things I noticed was that from a Kanban perspective in particular, teams had kind of defaulted to, well, Scrum isn't right for us, so we're just going to do Kanban, and Kanban for us is using a Kanban board and maybe some WIP limits. So that was one of the things that was stand out to me, was around kind of resetting around when we say we use Kanban in our way of working, what does that mean? But also, even for our teams that were using Scrum, they're still, visualizing stuff on a Kanban board, but thinking about kind of how long work takes or quantifying the impact of improvements. None of that thinking was really there across the board. So a lot of it was kind of, can we start to introduce some of those things that are in the Kanban guide that can allow teams to better understand, are they actually getting better? Are they actually improving in their way of working?
Yeah. And for the teams that were already using Kanban or loosely using some kind of Kanban with, you said some WIP limits, was it a specific type of team, or was it kind of all over the place in terms of the types of work they were doing?
I'd say kind of all, I'd say probably, yeah, it was a real mix, to be honest. It wasn't kind of like, oh, we're an operations team, so we use Kanban. We had, we had some of our teams that were building stuff for our web platform, for example. There were about 7 or 8 teams all using Kanban there. So it's not a case of, well, if you're not doing customer-facing stuff, then use Kanban, and if you are, use Scrum. It was really varied. There was no kind of, if you're this type of team, use Kanban. If you're not, use Scrum. So it was wide variety of teams using Kanban.
Okay, great. And how about its scale? So was there any kind of scaling practices in place to bring those teams together or create visibility at a feature epic level inside of ASOS?
Not really, no. Teams were certainly logically structured. So teams will sit within a platform, and a platform would sit within a domain. So there was kind of like, your hierarchy and structure in that sense. But things like a platform Kanban or a domain Kanban or even a tech portfolio Kanban were non-existent. The major projects in technology were all run via an Excel spreadsheet.
Very technical.
Yes.
Well, let's talk a little bit about how you got started with Kanban there. So it sounds like they were loosely familiar with Kanban or thought they were doing Kanban because there were WIP limits in place and some kind of Kanban boards. So how did you get started? Was it like a training program or just kind of like, let me show you a little bit more about what you could be doing? How did you kick that all off?
Yes, I was very fortunate in that some of the coaches that were here before me, they'd introduced to some teams the concept of flow metrics and using those to kind of measure the flow of work and if work is being delivered faster, how many things we're working on. So when I started, that was kind of something that was gaining traction, and we decided as a coaching team that was what we wanted to go after, because it was less about kind of the framework, more like the outcomes of the framework. So we focused heavily on kind of rolling out the flow metrics across teams, but very much from a perspective of it being opt-in. So it wasn't a case of, get the leaders to tell everyone you have to start using flow metrics. It was kind of regularly advertising this as something to teams they could use and how it would be beneficial to them. And then kind of growing from there. Because I've been in previous organizations where teams are kind of mandated to use it, or even their data is being ingested into a platform where other people can visualize it, but the teams themselves don't know how to. So that was kind of something that I observed. I was like, I really want to avoid that. So we very much focus on, okay, well, what teams would actually want to use this, and kind of showing them it. Often that would be through using dummy data. So to get them kind of naturally curious as to, well, what does our data show, or even doing training sessions for them where it uses the dummy data so they can learn in a safe space, but learn together. And then hopefully kind of the curiosity builds from there, and they start actually adopting it and using it in their context, and then start to reflect on, well, what of our working practices could we change in order to get the best out of this information?
Did you run into any fear with making that data more transparent or exposing that data? I know some teams are experiences I've had too, where the teams feel very like they don't want that information public yet because they want to understand it or maybe make it look better before it's exposed to, especially to leadership. Did you run into any fear around things?
We had to do kind of certainly in some conversations or training sessions, a bit of resetting as to what these were intended for. So very much marketing it as this is an improvement tool. It's not a management tool. So there's no one, looking at your cycle time and saying this has gone down, you're a bad team. It's more, this is something to help you. And if you don't want to use it, that's fine. It's not ideal, but there's always, I think when it comes to good coaching, part of it is about timing and knowing when it's the right time for teams to be trying this stuff. So there was a little bit of that, a little bit of kind of when we do the training or introducing it to teams, talking about good Heart's law as well. So kind of any setting of targets that we didn't want to do that. And we're very transparent in documenting all the ways that teams can game it. So kind of getting that clarified up front. So rather than just, oh, well, I know how I can game this, kind of like, yeah, here's how you can game it. So if you want to use it and you want to game it, there you go. But you're probably not going to get the best out of it. So those were kind of the two main resistant points, but a lot of it was fairly easy, which I think is kind of a good indication of the culture we have at ASOS around kind of continuous improvement and getting better.
Yeah, and when you think about the intervals, I guess, that you were reviewing the data on, I know some of the teams probably had a retrospective cadence, it sounds like, if they were using Scrum and a Kanban board. So did you fold into the retrospectives to review that data, or was there a different pattern for reviewing flow metrics?
Definitely getting started. Retros were quite the common thing, and a lot of it was kind of showing teams how other teams were using it. So rather than it be the agile coach come in and tell you how you should be using it, saying, well, go talk to that team and how they're using it. But certainly retros for a lot of teams were the logical starting point, looking at cycle time, looking at throughput and saying, okay, well, what stuff took too long? Did we complete more or less than the last time we met? And then it kind of grew from there, where teams would end up having like targeted metric sessions, like once a week, once a fortnight, where they just review their metrics and see, okay, what can we do about this? Where should we improve this? Where should we breaking that work down? That kind of thing.
Nice. Yeah. Did you have any teams that didn't believe their data at first? I feel like it's a thing. I like when teams are brand new to flow metrics. I feel like there's always one or two teams where you start looking at cycle time data and they're like, there's no way that's right. And there's no way it takes us that long to deliver a story, right? And so once you start digging into what's really going on behind that data, there's a little bit of disbelief in the numbers. Did you see that at all?
Yeah, there were a few instances. Some were quite funny. Where it was someone challenging, well, that can't have taken that long. But then you just click through and you show them the history, and then they can see that it actually did take that long. And it's like, oh, it's a bit embarrassing. And then there were other instances, more where maybe they hadn't configured their board correctly. So maybe the state mapping wasn't quite right. So the cycle time was showing longer than they would expect. But part of that was actually just due to the config that they had set up. But then that's kind of an easy in then as to, okay, well, then let's fix that, and then let's see if it actually reflects the true time you think it takes to complete work.
Nice. Yeah. I think it's always fun. And it's like, it's a nice tool as a coach too, because you get to step back a little bit. It's like all the things you've been trying to help a team understand, the data kind of tells the story for you in a really powerful way.
Yeah, there is that kind of odd, when someone challenges it as to, that can't be right, there is that split second in my mind where I think, please let this be right. Because if it isn't, you can just immediately lose all credibility. But thankfully, I haven't come across that yet.
Right. Well, you said that some of the teams had WIP limits. Let's go back to just kind of the basics here around definition of workflow. Were there any things that were harder to implement? Like, I don't know if you had service level expectations right away, or if there were other things that you had to add to the definition of workflow that weren't in place at the beginning.
Yeah, definitely kind of service level expectation. I think even now as a concept, I think that terminology doesn't land a lot of the time, whereas 85th percentile cycle time does. I don't know why that is. But certainly the beginning, kind of that thinking around the vast majority of stuff takes this long or less. That was definitely hard to overcome. WIP limits, to a degree, more people actually understanding what WIP limits are and using them, rather than just setting, WIP limit of 12. And it's like, well, you only have 3 in that column, so 12 probably seems a little bit odd. I'd say as well, policies. So policies between different statuses on the board and teams being familiar as to how they can configure that, and actually being a bit more stringent about it, but also not going overkill. I remember there was a team that I once worked with, and they ended up having like 10 columns on the board, and they had a policy for each, and the policy was like 7 bullet points, and it was like, I'm bored facilitating this, so I can't imagine you're going to actually use this in practice. So definitely, I think those were some challenges that they just kind of improved over time when you kind of give it a few months and then you revisit it and you kind of accept as a coach that, okay, that ship's kind of sailed. It's not quite how I want it to be, but it's not the end of the world. And yeah, I'd say that those were the main challenges. So the SLE and the policy side of things were quite hard ones.
Yeah, I've seen this. I've seen similar patterns with the workflow policies, especially where there's teams where there's a lot of dependencies or handoffs between other teams. I think the first reaction teams tend to have there with the workflow policies is like, it's a chance to police the other teams. It's like, we're going to make it really visible if we're not getting exactly what we need from this other team, or if we want to highlight the fact that work is getting stuck, and it's not our fault, right? And so you end up with a laundry list of policies then, because it turns into all the things that they feel like they haven't been able to track or make visible in the past.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think it takes a while for the teams to see that, like, less is more typically with those
Yeah.
workflow policies, right? It's really just, and I think in so many ways, the conversation of developing those workflow policies gets you 99% of what you want from workflow policies, right? We want to be on the same page. We want to make sure we're all understanding what's required for the work to move, but we don't need it to be a full checklist of items for every ticket to move from one stage of the workflow to the next. So
yeah, we have with a lot of kind of new teams that are forming, we do kind of like a kind of a definition of workflow type workshop just on a Miro board virtually, and a lot of that is kind of like, it's not really a hard artifact, it's more just gaining an appreciation for how we go from idea to actually getting it in production in users' hands. So yeah, we kind of we're a bit less strict around it now than we were at the beginning.
And you guys use Azure DevOps there, right? I feel like I've seen a lot of work that you've done.
Yeah, we did have a few teams in Jira, but we moved everything into one platform because the vast majority were Azure DevOps, and as an organization, we're quite a heavy Microsoft shop, so it kind of made logical sense for us.
Yeah. And you've posted a lot of blog posts in the past of different ways to kind of hack ADO to get what you need out of it from a Kanban perspective. We'll put some of those links in the YouTube recording notes from today's show. So if you're interested in any of the tricks that Nick's going to share or talk through here for ADO hacks, we'll make sure that we link to all of those as well, because there's some good content out there that you've shared. Well, let's talk about some of the metrics. So what was some of the first noticeable improvements or measurable improvements that you saw for your teams that got people going, oh my gosh, like this is making a big impact on how we're delivering?
So we kind of have a standard dashboard that we use with teams where we look at throughput, so count of completed items, and we look per week. We look at cycle time. We have a couple visualizations for cycle time. We look at I know Dan and Pratik would cringe at this, but we look at the average for the completed items in a particular week. And we also look at quite a key metric for us, I think, in understanding kind of if teams are working at a sustainable pace, is this metric called net flow. So it's the difference between the number of items started and completed in a given week. So I find that's really good, because unlike a lot of other metrics where you really want to be trending up or trending down, you want that to be at zero, which makes it quite unique and kind of rethinks metrics a little bit, because that means you're finishing and starting kind of as many things in a given week as possible. And that really is flow when we think about it. And then we also look at kind of bug rate, so the rate at which, if our throughput is 10, what percentage of that was actually bugs versus, value adding stuff like stories or PBIs. Just so we're kind of like, we could have high throughput, but if all we're doing is fixing bugs, we're probably doing something wrong from a quality perspective. And then we also look at kind of leading indicators like work item age, work in progress, how long since items were updated, and then also just looking at the trend of work item age and kind of bucketing that based on a kind of daily basis. I'd be happy to show it if that would be beneficial for the people watching. So I can show you, this is an example team in kind of true here's one I made earlier style. So here we have our throughput. So this is just how many items this team completed per week. Hovering on data point would show the breakdown, and then you can actually drill through and you can see what those items are and open it up in Azure DevOps. Like I said, cycle time, so the average for those items completed in that week. And then we also have these error bars that show the 90th and 10th percentile, I think it is. So that just shows us kind of, from a trend perspective, is it trending in the right direction? For this team, it's not. It's trending upward, meaning items are taking longer. The quality chart, like I said, the percentage of stuff that's bugs versus not bugs. So again, kind of see, okay, well, this is trending downward, which means good. So we're not getting as many bugs for this team. And then the net flow being the difference in started and completed on a given week. And again, if you hover on a data point, it will show you how it's come to that value. So this has a positive 2 number, meaning the team finished 2 items more than which they started. And here, when we hover on it, we see, well, they started 7 and they completed 9. And then when we look at our work in progress page, kind of our leading indicators for flow in that sense, We've got our work item age chart, which hopefully most people are familiar with. That will tell you a particular item, how long it's been in progress. Each dot represents an item. And then we've got our 85th and 50th percentiles there. We've got how long it's been since the work item was last updated. And then we've got our work in progress chart here. If a team is using WIP limits as well, one of the things that we visualize is whenever they've breached those WIP limits, so a red dot appears and it shows you the column on the board, how many items were in that column on that day and what the actual WIP limit was. And then the bottom right chart here, this just shows you kind of the split of the work item age. So you want a good blend of orange and grey here. If you've got a lot of orange, it means you've got a lot of old stuff sticking around, you're not finishing it. If you've got a lot of grey, that means your work's probably flowing quite fast because stuff isn't getting too old. So that just kind of gives us that split. And when we kind of started this journey, we started putting together case studies on our Confluence page. So here we can see like where a team's improve their throughput. So either side of this zero value here, we can see the throughput. It's increased in terms of total count of completed items, but it's also become a lot more predictable. The variation there from 3 to 17 is a lot less than from 7 to 14 on the right-hand side. We can see where we've got, cycle time has gone down and is a lot more consistent. We've got work item age where, the oldest item for this team was over 600 days at this point. After a bit of a review of their metrics, tidying up their workflow, the oldest item then became 23 days. I think it's here. Again, lots of WIP here that hasn't been updated. Then it becomes a lot lower. And then this one I quite like to show, showing this is a kind of team of teams level. So it's kind of an aggregation of multiple teams. And that net flow chart I was talking about before. Here you can see there's big fluctuations in the amount of orange and the amount of blue, meaning kind of a lot of starting, a lot of finishing, a lot of starting, a lot of finishing. Common pattern you might see with Scrum teams where they start everything on day 1 of the sprint and finish it on day 10 of the sprint if they're doing 2-week sprints. And here we can see there's a lot less variation now. There's a lot less kind of ups and downs in that chart, meaning teams are working at a more sustainable pace, which likely means they're probably less stressed and less likely to get burnt out. And we never want that to occur for our teams. So we kind of can draw some causal relationship there with team happiness, team health, and the flow data that we use.
This is awesome. So one of the things I feel like we hear a lot with new teams that are new to Kanban, new to flow metrics, and just starting to look at all of this is that that's a lot. It's a lot of data. It's a lot to interpret. Was there a scrum master on each team that was helping the team understand this data, or was the team working together to understand it? Or was there any kind of hurdle in getting the teams really to be able to look at this and understand what was happening with their work movement?
So we don't have scrum masters. We don't have delivery managers or agile delivery managers in any of our teams. We have engineering leads, and typically they would take on this responsibility, but not always. Certainly in teams that I've worked with, it's maybe been the business analyst or the product manager because they've seen it and understand it and can get it and are passionate about it. So it's more kind of we trust our teams to certainly look at it, but we're not prescriptive as to this is your role and you should do it. We kind of leave that to the teams to decide as to this is important. Predominantly this role takes it on, but it's ultimately a team responsibility to care about it.
Are there ever any points in the data or signals for leadership to get involved? Like where a manager would go, oh, like your net flow chart. Is there something on there that would make a manager go, okay, now there's a signal here that there's a problem. I'm going to step in.
Certainly there's been instances where I've worked with teams and I've seen data that doesn't lend itself to an environment where they're going to succeed. And through discussion with the team, I've come to the realization it's not within the team's control. So classic manager unable to say no. Net flow chart ends up being lots of orange, lots of starting, not a lot of finishing. So there's certainly been instances where I've had conversations with leaders as to this is the consequence of your actions. So, this team's feeling the pressure and it's reflected in the data. but not all that is within their control. Similarly, blocker data as well. So one of the things I didn't show is some teams are getting really good at actually logging the reason work gets blocked when it does get blocked. So whether that be another team, whether that be things like business protection periods. So when we can't deploy stuff because there's it's for ASOS, it's Black Friday, for example. And again, teams can kind of use that information as to, we keep getting blocked by this third party. Can you do something about it and use this information to help with that conversation? And one of the things I mentioned at the beginning was around us using Excel for our portfolio. We actually moved about 18 months ago to a kind of portfolio Kanban. And one of the things with that is we look at key flow metrics, albeit from a portfolio epic perspective. And again, there's certainly leaders of the technology organization I've worked with to show them, okay, this WIP keeps going up, and as a consequence, this cycle time keeps going up. So we need to think about how we're going to control the funnel as to what's coming in and out of the system.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned, especially with NetFlow, that looking at this kind of helped with stabilizing the work so that your teams weren't stressed out, right? I think a lot of times when we talk about Kanban or Kanban versus Scrum, right, Kanban kind of gets a reputation for not caring about the people. We're more focused on data than we are about people. But I think you bring up a great point here. Like, a lot of what we're trying to do in managing the work is making the work better for the people, right? The people doing the work, making it easier to deliver. Were there other things about either the data or the workflows that you feel like really changed how the teams were collaborating or prioritizing their work, or things that just made their lives easier?
There was certainly a point we got to where the flow metrics had kind of hit a ceiling, in that we felt like we'd done all we can with that. What we then started to observe were other things that teams were involved in the organization where we could be using information to make their lives easier. So we had a quarterly planning kind of cadence, not anything like a safe quarterly planning where we do normalized story points and all that stuff. More just understanding teams' capacity for a given period and understanding, well, what big ticket ideas that the organization wants to deliver, do teams have the capacity to do that? So one of the things we started looking at was at things like feature data or epic data if you're using Jira, understanding at that level things like batch size, introducing the concept of right sizing to teams, introducing probabilistic forecasting as well, and Monte Carlo simulation. I think that alleviated a lot of stress from teams when it comes to conversations around stuff like estimation or forecasting, or when are we likely to deliver this thing. So a lot of what we do is kind of observing kind of patterns that were occurring across different teams and how we could be using information, not just in ADO, but in other tools as well, how we could be using that information to help teams. So that was kind of the logical next step that we took. And again, I'd be happy to share that if people were interested in seeing it.
Yeah, I see Uma asking a question about the tooling. So she was asking what tool was being used for the metrics that you were showing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, so all the tools that I show are open source things that I build and support myself. So they're all free. I have different GitHub repositories, and if you ever read my blogs, I put a link to the repository in the bottom. So for any teams that are using Azure DevOps or Jira, you can download the template. It's a Power BI file. So if you're not using Power BI, it probably wouldn't be useful for you. But Power BI, a desktop version of it, is free. So you download that, download the template, plug in your information. There's a guide on the GitHub page as to how to do it. And then you can start to use that information. So yeah, I always try to make stuff that I build free. I know it's not the best stuff out there, but certainly I think it's better than doing nothing. So yeah, if you're ever wondering what tools I use, it's probably in a repository somewhere.
Awesome. We'll make sure we link to all of that as well. Nick, so you were talking about feature delivery here, and getting the visibility into the feature level metrics as well. What kind of things got leadership's attention in this journey to say either, oh, this is working or this isn't working, or were they able to start to look at a tangible improvement in speed to market at that feature level?
So one of the things that I think the technology leaders certainly struggled with was when it came to things like that quarterly planning event, not having much transparency around how teams have come to decisions around their capacity, understanding well what stuff is being carried over. Is that the right thing to still be working on? Should we actually abandon those ideas? And once we showed them how capacity planning could be an exercise done in seconds, minutes at most, and then how we could aggregate that across multiple teams, that certainly, I remember the director I showed it to, he immediately wanted to know how quickly I could be presenting it to the leadership team. Because I think that simplified a lot of the conversations around capacity, and a lot of the ambiguity as well around what capacity means. Amazingly, for some people in teams, they deem capacity as we have capacity to start something. And I've always come from the school of, well, capacity is surely your capacity to finish it. So we were at least helping the organization align on an approach as to, well, when we say, do you have capacity, what does that actually mean?
Yeah, no, I love that. And I think we spend a lot of time talking about the estimating side of all of this, right? And helping teams feel better about using data to probabilistically forecast when something's going to get done, so they're not on the hook to throw some estimate out there that they don't feel comfortable with, or that they feel like they're going to get held to without really having the right information to put that number in front of folks in the first place. But the same, you could apply everything I just said to that same argument about capacity, right? When we ask the team, how much capacity do you have for something? I think all of the same things apply. Nobody wants to give a number. They come up with some ridiculous way of padding that thing to try to make it so that they're not pulling in more work. And so we do all of the same, the same patterns when we start thinking about how to estimate or how to give a number for how much capacity we have as a team too, where if we look at the data, we can use our past performance in the same way to forecast that. Well, I see a lot of great questions coming in already from folks listening in. I'm going to read this first one off from Shivam. What will be an elevator pitch for a team who is using Scrum for 3 years and suddenly asked to change into Kanban, where all the fixed events get less relevant, especially planning, cadence, and story points?
Oh, a nice, easy question. What will be the elevator pitch? I guess I give two parts to the answer. My simple answer would be, nothing in Kanban says you have to do away with those things. So if you want to stick with them, stick with them. There's nothing stopping you doing that. I would say for me, the elevator pitch is, this stuff is much more grounded in reality, and it talks in a language that, in my opinion, everyone in the organization could understand. So we're talking about count of things, we're talking about duration in terms of days. We're removing a lot of that agile language voodoo ambiguity that often, to be honest, just really frustrates people. So my elevator pitch would be that, well, this stuff is based on empiricism and it's real. So I think that's how every organization should be working, rather than kind of stuff that makes sense to some people but doesn't make sense to others.
Yeah, love that. All right, there's another question here from Chris. How did management respond to the use of probabilistic forecasting for your teams?
I know Chris as well. So Chris, I appreciate you asking a question. I think once we sat down and really explained it and had support from engineering leaders who still code or used to code, they saw that it was beneficial in terms of the way it appreciated the complexity that is software development, and the way you can change the parameters that go into the forecast that you use. So probably one of the proudest moments for me at ASOS, at the minute, you may or may not be aware of. So it's not a big leak that I'm revealing. ASOS is working on a new loyalty program, and it's kind of been mentioned in our annual reports. It's going to be a big thing for us this year. And the VPs in the organization wanted to understand from a date perspective when the loyalty program was likely to be able to launch. And we all sat in a room and we actually went through a probabilistic forecast for that and showed the different potential scenarios and outcomes that could occur, and what had gone into that and how we would regularly update that as and when we got new information. And I think the transparency that came with that made it easy for leaders to buy in. There was no one saying, "Oh, I want you to use velocity," or "I want you to use time estimates for every single thing in the backlog." I think they appreciated that this was a good middle ground of giving them what they need, but also accounting for the complexity that the teams were dealing with.
Yeah. Nick, in that scenario, did you run into any struggles? I think the concept of continuously reforecasting can be a hard sell for leaders, because it's like, well, what do you mean it's going to keep changing? When you introduce the fact, like you said, that things continue to change, priorities change, capacity changes, our focus changes, all these things, right, that impact our forecast change every day. Did you meet any resistance to that concept that you would need to keep looking at that forecast?
There was certainly some skepticism as to like, well, how accurate are the forecasting models? One of the things that I've done in the past, which people can read about, is showing the accuracy of the forecast that we use. So we'd already accounted for that scenario in the kind of how accurate is the model. When it came to the reforecasting part, not so much, if I'm being honest. I think because it just kind of makes sense when you think about it logically. It's kind of like, if you're using a sat nav to get to a destination, there's continuously reforecasting, isn't it? Based on kind of, changes in traffic, if there's an accident ahead. And often I use that analogy when I'm explaining it to people as to, well, this is why we do it. Because just like when you're trying to get to a destination, this is the same thing we're doing with our forecasting. So I think if you can have something that is relatable to people, that's like their everyday life, similar to things like forecasting and the weather and the percentage likelihood of rain, I think that just makes it an easier concept to grasp for people, and it just becomes common sense rather than kind of being daunting language like Monte Carlo simulation. So yeah, that would be that's the approach that we took.
Nice. All right, Laura's gonna bring up story pointing for you. Laura's question is: I find teams struggling with right sizing when they're more used to story pointing. How do you approach this?
I would say use both and see what the difference is. Same way when it came to things like forecasting delivery dates and using velocity and using item count. For me, when I got to a point where I could show that there was no difference, it then became an easier conversation to move away from them. So I've found through kind of my own experience, I used to be like, I hate story points, and if you use story points, you're stupid. I've kind of cooled down a bit now, and it's more just kind of like, okay, well, let's just use both and see. And if you don't want to use both, then it's a non-starter, isn't it? But I think using both is a good middle ground in that you get what you want, but also they're not completely doing away with maybe something they're comfortable with. So my advice would be use both, see if it makes any difference, and if it doesn't, then you know what you can move towards.
Love it. All right, you've got a question here from Heinrich. When starting out with a new team, how long would you say it takes before you see real changes in numbers or behaviors?
By real changes, I assume you mean positive changes. I would say, in my experience, kind of 6 to 12 weeks, I would say, if based on my experience. I think often when you go in with a team and maybe you see that work isn't flowing, and you find that a lot of stuff they're not actually working on, or it's become stagnant, or it's blocked, you might end up moving a lot of stuff to done, and maybe your cycle time will actually go even higher as a result of that. So then you need that period after where it starts to kind of normalize. And certainly when we work with our teams, when we look at one of our aspects around agility, which is flow, we say kind of don't do any less than 6 weeks because you're probably not going to see a change. So we find that 6 to 12 week range would be what would be I'd suggest.
Yeah. And I think, I would add to that too, one of the patterns I see for a lot of organizations is that the way that the work is broken up really has a big impact on how long it takes to see real changes in numbers and behaviors too. I think a lot of organizations who are very used to breaking work down into such small pieces that it's almost like a story is a piece of a story or a subtask of a story. Or we were talking earlier this week about an organization where the stories are getting closed at the end of every sprint, really, whether they're done or not. And then another story gets created for the remaining work. And so you have these really fragmented pieces of work that you're starting to track that aren't delivering actual value. And then it makes it really hard to get meaningful metrics from those things. I think another thing to think about is the value broken up in a way that's going to give you the data that you need to start to track things like what Nick's talking about here for leaders. And if not, it's almost like you have to start there first. Otherwise, you're not really getting data on delivering value. You're just getting data on kind of closing out work items at the end of every sprint or at the end of every whatever your time box.
Artificially slicing at story level or even feature level, like right sizing your features to be like a dev feature, a test feature, a deploy feature. It's like, that's not the kind of thing.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and then I think there's some fear there, especially at the story level too, that our stories are going to get bigger, right? Like, well, our stories we were making as small as possible, but maybe it was taking 4 or 5 stories to deliver something valuable. If we make the stories the size of what would be required to deliver a chunk of value, does that mean they're going to be bigger than a sprint or bigger than our past cycle time was showing for those stories? And the answer might be yes, but that's okay, right? Like you said, that's the reality of how long it's taking us to deliver something valuable. And that reality is far more valuable to us in using all of that data to be able to forecast accurately and see what's really going on than making things as small as possible just so that the numbers look better. Well, I have a question for you, Nick. If you were, if you were to start this whole journey back over with ASOS, what would you do differently, or would you do anything differently if you were to start again?
I don't know if I'd do anything differently because the things that I got wrong have kind of led to a kind of endpoint, which I think is good for where we are. I'd maybe we could have done it a different way around. Maybe we could have started with the portfolio stuff first, and then worked to kind of like the story level, if you will. That could have been another way to go about it. I've done that in the past, where you start at the higher level because that's kind of really where you can affect change. But no, I don't think so. I think it's quite fortunate that I've got so many things wrong before coming here. That kind of like the things that could have gone wrong haven't gone wrong, or haven't gone wrong as badly as I thought they could have gone. So no, I don't think. And maybe if we could have been closer to the value side of things, or if we could, start to have some conversations around, if we shifted towards methods like right sizing, for example, could we quantifiably show from a numbers perspective more value's been added? But part of that is also dependent on, do you have that link to the organization at that point in time? And for us, we just didn't. So in another organization, I might do that differently. It might be starting with the value side of things and getting really close to that. But I think for where ASOS was and is now, I'm happy with the journey that we went on.
That's awesome. Well, what advice do you have for other teams or other organizations who are considering, either have similar challenges to what you described at the beginning, or considering whether or not Kanban might be a good fit for them?
I would say don't worry too much around if your flow of work doesn't reflect, I don't know, a cross-functional team, or it's still very kind of waterfally in that sense. starting with visualizing it, understanding where work's getting blocked or how long work's taking is better than doing nothing or waiting for the perfect scenario. When it comes to getting people curious about the kind of thing like flow metrics, for example, I would say the number one thing for me now is always starting with like dummy data, not real data. Don't go straight into a team and say, this is your data, this is what it shows, because almost always that will just annoy them, and it won't make you feel part of the team. Quite frankly, you feel like an outsider. So I would say, don't overthink it. Don't be precious about being too simplified or too granular in your workflow. So, years ago, I would have said we need to go really granular with our workflow. Now I'm kind of like, just take it as it is, and you'll learn over time what makes sense. And always be prepared for some ideas that may well be useful, might not be useful at that point in time. So the capacity planning one I mentioned, when we first did the planning, the quarterly planning thing, we had that built and ready to go for teams, and no teams used it. And it took about 3 quarters for it to come back around and then become a thing that teams wanted to use. So don't be disheartened if there's something that, this is a really good fit and this would solve a problem, but other teams don't quite want to use it just yet. Always be prepared that some stuff is just not right now, but keep it on your backlog, because it may be that further down the line you come back to it. So those will be my tips for folks out there.
That's awesome. Yeah. Well, we've got a couple more questions here. I'm going to try to squeeze in a few more before the top of the hour here. Stefano has a question for you. How far do you think we are from leveraging Kanban and flow metrics when contracting with partners? In my organization, using t-shirt sizing, story points, time and materials, fixed contracts is still a common
another
thing.
person I know. Thank you, Stefano, for your question. These aren't plants, by the way. These aren't people that ask questions. I think with your large outsource IT or technology providers, very, very far off. It's so far removed from what they are used to when working with clients, that I'd be amazed if that ever became a thing. With smaller and more boutique organizations, it could become a thing. With us at ASOS, we use plenty of third parties, but it's more they staff the teams rather than it being something where we're contracting with partners in that sense. So, will it become a thing? I'd be very surprised. I think it would just be such an upheaval for that industry that I just can't see it working. Is my honest opinion, and I've been in other organizations where I've seen contracting based on story points, for example, and it was a truly horrendous environment. It was like we will guarantee 200 story points per sprint. What does that even mean? How is that even legally enforceable if it's not 200 points? I don't know. I certainly think some concepts could definitely be useful from the Kanban world. So SLEs are a great example. In a previous organization where I worked, we were trying to move away from SLA to SLE because we felt like that alleviated pressure from the team, but also in that particular scenario, having SLAs that were 99.9% type things just didn't make sense for the context. So I think there are definitely some parts that kind of traditional contracting methods might be able to use from, but will we see a big kind of radical change in that industry? I don't think so, is my honest opinion.
Yeah, it's a hard one. We've done some work in the past with some contracting organizations to try to help bring probabilistic forecasting into how they write their contracts, and it is really hard because it for all the reasons you just said, right? And for a lot of what they've come up with is it creating kind of a budget for them and understanding how much work they can get done by a certain time. So, looking at the Monte Carlo more as a how much instead of a when, I think can be a nice tool in those scenarios, but also getting them comfortable with what we were talking about earlier, and that can change, right? And that you're still going to have to continuously reforecast how much you can get done by a certain fixed date. And that's a evolving cycle, right? You need to be on top of that and be looking at that all the time, even if it is a fixed contract. Shivam has another question for you. What are the measures we should take in Kanban to make right feature prioritization within product management by value, efforts, or risks?
I would say that if we're talking in Kanban, there isn't any by definition. I would say any of that stuff is a guess, and I think that's what a lot of people seem to forget. Any of that stuff is potential value. It's not actual value. And, there's some really interesting stuff out there around different prioritization frameworks, and actually if those prioritization frameworks are more effective than simply focusing on flow practices. So if you've read Dan and Pratik's Don't Be a Ditka work, I think that's fascinating, because that talks about CD3, cost of delay divided by duration, which is lauded as kind of one of the best prioritization techniques out there. But actually their study showed that I think it was right sizing actually was more effective in terms of value delivery than cost of delay divided by duration was. So you're not using any product management prioritization framework there. You're just focusing on right sizing. So I would say you're better off placing your efforts in actually understanding and measuring the value once you ship stuff. That would be a much more useful effort, investment of your time, than focusing on, a particular framework to follow. Because in my experience, people inevitably gain those things, or, they put a bunch of numbers in, and when it comes to reality, it ships, and actually it was nowhere near that from a value perspective. So I just find those things to be kind of, unless you understand them as these are just guesses, if you're actually hoping that they will deliver more value for your organization, you're probably going to be disappointed, is my honest answer.
So you're saying not WSJF. WSJF's not mathematically sound,
certainly the safe
objective.
Version of it that's the most bonkers thing to see.
Right. I know. We've got one more here from Neha. Any particular thing that needs to be taken care when starting Kanban for POC work?
I would just say that people are bought into trying to make it a success. That's, you could say about everything, right? But I think, if you are trying Kanban and that's a different approach to how you typically would take with POC, you need to go into that with your eyes open. And you need to be prepared for some bits where it's going to be a bit uncomfortable, or you're not sure, or you need to Google it to find the answer. Not everyone likes that, particularly if you've been working for 10, 15, 20 years, you're kind of trained to have to know all the answers, right? So I would say just be going in and prepared to get some things wrong, or you're going to have to unlearn and relearn stuff. So long as you're going in with that attitude across the team, you should be fine. If you're going in and you're thinking this isn't going to work, then your Kanban approach to POC is just not going to succeed, in my opinion. So just be open and honest, and be prepared that sometimes it's going to be quite hard.
Yeah. Love this. Great questions from everyone today. Thank you all for joining us. Nick, where can people find you, and what's next in your journey?
Nicolas Brown on LinkedIn, if you want to find me there. I'm also on Blue Sky as mbrown02. I'm not going to mention the other platform that you could use as an alternative to Blue Sky. And then you find me on GitHub as well, and I'm sure we'll post links there. For me, I will be moving to a new organization, actually, in the next, it's less than a month to go now. I'll be moving to a product consultancy called Thrive Partners. So we'll be focusing a lot more kind of helping organizations build the best digital products in the most effective manner. So that's the next challenge for me on the horizon.
And any conferences on your schedule for
Yes,
2025?
I am doing an internal conference for Cambridge University Press in a few weeks' time. And then I will be going to Agile Swarming in Poland and doing the keynote there. And then I will also be speaking at CraftCon in May, which I'm quite looking forward to, kind of looking at the names that are involved. I'm like, oh, didn't think I'll be speaking with those people. So that'll be in Budapest. And I believe it's actually in a railway museum, which I'm going to take my son and my wife, because my son will be over the moon. He's a big fan of trains at the minute, so I'm sure he'll have a great time.
That will be great. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us today. We'll get our show posted up in our YouTube channel following this session, and we'll include all those links to the work that you mentioned and places where people can learn more about the work that you've done. I want to thank everybody for joining us today for Be on the Board. We hope that you found some inspiration and things that you can take away from today's story. Mark your calendars. So our next session will be February 25th. We're going to sit down with Jack Arndt from Platform Science to learn more about how he overcame the burden of cross-team dependencies and lacking visibility by building a portfolio Kanban system using Jira product discovery. So join us for that conversation next. If you have a story about how Kanban helped your team or organization achieve something extraordinary, we'd love to hear from you too. You can reach out to us on LinkedIn if you'd like to share your journey or encourage us to reach out to somebody that you know. It might just help inspire others. And if you're looking for a partner to guide your team or organization on its Kanban journey, check out the Pro Kanban Efficiency Lab. Our goal is to help you design a system that delivers measurable results while giving your teams their time back. Check out www.prokanban.org/lab to learn more. We'll see you all next time on Beyond the Board. Thanks again, Nick.